When the human she wed revealed his power, the alien queen could only stare in away. The first thing my council said when I told them I was marrying a human was nothing. There was just silence, the kind of silence that carries more insult than any spoken word ever could. Lord Drenveth, my oldest advisor, set down his crystal goblet so carefully on the table that the soft click of it against the obsidian surface sounded almost like a period at the end of a sentence that said, "You cannot be serious." I was serious. His name was Elian Cole. He arrived at the docking bay of my palace on Kethara Prime on a gray transport vessel with no military markings, no honor guard, and no fanfare. Just him, a single travel case, and the kind of easy, unhurried walk that suggested he had never once in his life felt he needed to arrive anywhere, dramatically. I watched him from the upper observation gallery, because I did not want my first impression of him to be shaped by the formality of a throne room introduction. I wanted to see him when he thought no one important was watching. That is when you learn what something truly is. He stepped off the ramp onto the palace landing bay floor and looked up, not at the towering spires of crystalline architecture, not at the six-winged sentinel birds that circled the upper towers. He looked up at the sky. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the twin suns of my world, and then he exhaled slowly through his nose. A small smile crossed his face, not the nervous smile of someone performing confidence, a genuine one, as if the sky pleased him. He was unremarkable by every measurable standard the Galactic Registry used. The registry listed humans as a Class IV species. In practical terms, that meant they ranked below species with natural body armor, below species with psionic ability, below species with biological longevity exceeding 3 centuries, and below species capable of unassisted atmospheric flight. Humans had none of those things. They were soft-bodied, short-lived, psionically inert, and entirely dependent on technology for survival in hostile environments. The registry notes were almost sympathetic in tone, almost. My counsel had read those notes carefully, and used them freely in the argument they presented to me over 2 long evenings. Lord Drenveth led the objections with characteristic thoroughness. He laid out the political optics. He described how the Vorki Syndicate would interpret my marriage as weakness. He reminded me that the Kethara Dominion had held sovereignty over 11 star systems for 400 years, because its rulers had never once projected softness. Then he folded his hands on the table and looked at me with those ancient amber eyes and said, very quietly, that a queen who marries a Class IV life form sends a signal to every predator in the known galaxy. I told him that a queen who only ever marries for power invites predators who think she can be bought. He had no answer for that. What he also did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the treaty I was negotiating with humanity was not merely about their star systems. It was about what lay beneath those systems. 3 of humanity's inhabited worlds sat directly above the Vareth Corridor, the only navigable passage through the Sullen Nebula. Whoever controlled access to that corridor controlled trade flow for a quarter of the known galaxy. I had been trying to negotiate access to that corridor diplomatically for 6 years. Every human representative I had dealt with had been polite, precise, and absolutely immovable on the terms. They gave nothing away for free. Elian Cole was not a random selection. He had been chosen by the human government specifically for this assignment. His file said he was a senior diplomatic liaison with 14 years of experience in multi-species negotiations. His file did not say much else that seemed relevant at the time. I had skimmed it once and found it unremarkable. No military background. No combat citations, no notable biological enhancements, average height for a human male, brown hair, an educational record that was distinguished but not extraordinary. The kind of file that disappears into a stack of other files without leaving an impression. I should have read it more carefully. I would learn that lesson slowly, over the months that followed. He was given chambers in the east wing of the palace, positioned respectfully but not lavishly. I had instructed my staff to treat him with the same courtesy extended to any foreign dignitary of equivalent diplomatic rank. Nothing more, nothing less. My personal attendant, Isareth, a meticulous woman who had served my household for decades, reported back to me on his first evening that he had unpacked his own case, asked for directions to the palace kitchen, made himself something to eat using ingredients he found there, and then sat in the garden near the water feature for an hour before sleeping. He had thanked every member of the staff he encountered by name. He had asked each of them, individually, how they were. Isareth mentioned this last detail twice. I noted that she seemed surprised by it. In my court, no foreign dignitary had ever asked her how she was. The formal introduction happened the following morning. I received him in the smaller audience chamber, the one I used for working meetings rather than ceremonial ones. I had chosen this deliberately. I wanted him to understand from the first moment that I viewed this arrangement as a functional partnership, not a performance. 12 of my court advisors were present, arranged along the curved walls in a way that was intended to be subtly overwhelming to guests who were not accustomed to the weight of institutional power. Elian Cole walked in, stopped at the appropriate distance, and gave the Cathara greeting bow with correct form. Someone had clearly briefed him on protocol. Then he straightened, looked at me directly, and said good morning in my own language. Not perfectly, the tones were slightly off, but the attempt was deliberate and genuine, and something about the simplicity of it cut through the careful choreography of the room in a way I had not expected. I replied in his language. His expression shifted very slightly, a flicker of surprised pleasure that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. We spoke for 2 hours that first morning. He was measured and careful and extremely good at listening. Most diplomats I dealt with used listening as a pause between their own speeches. Elian listened as if what you were saying was actually data he intended to use. It was a subtle difference, but it was there. By the end of that meeting, I had told him more about my long-term strategic concerns regarding the Vorkai syndicate than I had intended to. I reviewed the conversation afterward and could not identify the precise moment he had steered me there. He had not asked directly. He had simply made the space available, and I had walked into it. I made a note to be more careful. The formal wedding ceremony took place 3 weeks later, brief and functional, as I had stipulated. My council attended with the particular expression of people watching something they disapprove of, but have accepted they cannot stop. The Dominion citizens who watched the broadcast were, according to my communications staff, mostly curious. Humans were rare enough on Kethera Prime that his presence alone was a novelty. Several news commentators described him as charming, which I found a strange word to apply in a political context. Others used the word ordinary, which I found more accurate and more interesting in ways I could not yet fully articulate. He stood beside me through the ceremony with a steadiness that I found myself noticing more than I expected to. Not stiffness, steadiness. There is a difference. Stiffness comes from effort. Steadiness comes from somewhere else. From something that does not need to be maintained because it simply is. When the ceremony ended and we walked back through the hall together for the first time as a unit, Lord Drenveth watched us from the gallery above with an expression I had known on his face for 40 years. It was the expression he wore when he was recalculating. One small detail stayed with me from that entire day. At one point during the reception that followed, a young Kethera nobleman, the son of a border house lord, had made a remark within earshot of Elian. A dismissive remark, laced with the specific kind of contempt that young nobles use to perform status in front of their peers. It was the sort of remark designed to make someone flinch or redden or look away. Elian heard it. I know he heard it because I was watching his face at the moment it landed. His expression did not change. He turned toward the young nobleman, made brief and entirely pleasant eye contact, and then returned his attention to the conversation he had been having as if nothing had occurred. No anger, no performance of patience, just a simple, complete absence of any reaction that the nobleman could use. The young man looked uncertain for the rest of the evening. I understood why. He had thrown something and found no surface for it to land on. That night, in the quiet of the palace, I sat at my desk and pulled up the Human Diplomat's file again. This time I read every page. I did not find anything that explained what I had seen that day. But I found myself reading more carefully than I had the first time, which told me something in itself. Whatever Elian Cole was, he was not what the Galactic Registry said he was. I could not yet prove that. I could not yet name what was different, but the certainty sat in my chest like a stone in still water. Not moving, just there, quietly waiting to be found. The second month was when the whispers started, not loud ones. Kethara court culture did not produce loud whispers. It produced the quiet, slanted kind, the ones that travel through a room not in words but in the precise angle at which one person leans toward another. I had been reading those angles my entire life, and I read them now with the automatic fluency of long practice. The whispers were about Elian. Most of them were still dismissive. Class IV, the Queen's political accessory. These were the versions circulating among the younger noble families, who measured everything in terms of biological rank. But there was another category of whisper, newer and harder to place, coming from people who had actually spent time near him. Members of my staff, junior diplomatic aides who had been assigned to work with him on the treaty details, 1 or 2 of my senior advisors. These whispers were not dismissive. They were puzzled, as if they had reached for something and found it heavier than expected. I began paying closer attention. The formal treaty negotiations were happening in parallel with his role as my consort, and he moved between both with an ease that I found quietly remarkable. In the negotiation sessions, he was sharp without being aggressive. He gave ground on small points with no emotional investment, and held the critical positions with a patience that outlasted every attempt to shift him. I had negotiated with representatives from 43 species across my political career. I had learned to read the pressure points where a negotiator's composure began to thin. I could not find that point in Elian Cole. Either he had none, or it was buried so deeply that no standard approach could reach it. My chief negotiator, a woman named Orith Tell, who had been in service to the Dominion for 60 years, came to my private office 3 weeks into the treaty process and stood in front of my desk with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Orith Tell was not a woman given to visible emotion. She had conducted the Dominion's most complex negotiations across species that could physically reshape reality with a thought. She said to me, without preamble, "I do not know how to read him." I told her to keep trying. She said, with a slight hesitation that was enormous by her standards, "I think he already knows what we will accept." I think he knew before he sat down. I asked how that was possible given that our internal position documents were classified. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I do not believe he accessed any documents. I believe he read us." I thought about this for a long time after she left. The incident at the Feast of Venom happened in the 4th week. The Feast of Venom is a tradition in Cathara noble culture that outsiders are rarely informed about in advance. The drinks served at the formal evening banquet contain a mild neurotoxin native to Cathara Prime. For Cathara biology, the effect is a pleasant warmth and a slight sharpening of the senses. For most other species, the experience ranges from uncomfortable to briefly incapacitating. No permanent harm comes to anyone. The point is not injury. The point is observation. How a guest responds to unexpected adversity, whether they show it or hide it, tells you what you need to know about how they will behave when the real pressure arrives. The protocol is that guests are not warned. If they happen to have done their research thoroughly enough to know about the tradition in advance, that is considered a mark in their favor. I watched Elian from across the banquet table as the first course was served. He lifted his glass, and I watched for the signs I knew to look for: a slight tightening around the eyes, a change in breathing, a careful stillness that people adopt when they are suppressing a physical response. His biology should have registered the compound within 90 seconds of the first drink. He drank. He set the glass down. He continued his conversation with the elderly border house lord seated beside him, a man named Gorith Var, who was known for talking at considerable length about agricultural trade tariffs. Elian appeared entirely engaged in this conversation. He asked a question about soil mineral content on Gorith Var's home world. He took a second drink of his wine while Gorith Var answered. I leaned slightly toward my personal aide and said very quietly that I wanted a full biological readout from the passive health monitors in Elian's chair, transmitted to me privately after the meal. The readout came to my private data screen 2 hours later, while I was still at the banquet. I reviewed it once and then sat very still for a moment. His cardiovascular readings had elevated slightly approximately 95 seconds after his first drink. His body temperature had risen by a minor but measurable amount. His pain response indicators had registered. He had absolutely felt the compound. He had simply chosen not to show it at all. Not a flicker, not a breath held too long, nothing. When the meal concluded and the guests began to move toward the reception hall, I fell into step beside him and said, without particular ceremony, that I hoped the wine had been to his taste. I was watching his face when I said it. He looked at me with those calm brown eyes and said that it had an unusual finish but that he had enjoyed it nonetheless. And then, with a timing so precise it could not have been accidental, he added, I noticed it had a warmth to it that the other wines did not, a particular kind of warmth. And he held my gaze for exactly 1 additional second before looking away toward the reception hall. He knew I had been watching him. He had known the entire time. I did not say anything further. But I filed the moment with great care. The incident with the war beast happened 2 weeks after the feast. We had traveled to the eastern border installation at Vethkara to conduct an inspection of the Dominion's frontier defense systems. It was a working visit. I brought a small staff contingent, and Elian came as part of my official party. The installation housed, among other things, a holding facility for several Cathara war beasts, creatures bred over centuries for military applications. They were large enough to tear through standard hull plating with their secondary limbs. They were also in captivity, extremely sensitive to any change in the scent signature or movement patterns of individuals in their environment. New arrivals, people they had not cataloged before, could trigger a reactive charge. The facility handlers were experienced and the risk was managed carefully. But on our third hour of inspection, moving through a section of the outdoor containment perimeter, one of the larger specimens broke its tether line. The mechanism failure was instant and, in the moment, completely silent. The warbeast was oriented toward our group before any alarm sounded. It covered the initial ground between itself and us very quickly. The 3 members of my guard who were closest moved to position in front of me as trained. In doing so, they momentarily created a gap in the group's formation. Elian was standing at the edge of that gap, slightly separated from the main cluster, in what was, from the warbeast's perspective, an isolated position. What happened in the next few seconds I have replayed many times in my memory, because I watched it with my full attention and I still cannot entirely account for it with the frameworks I had at the time. The warbeast charged toward Elian's position. In any reasonable assessment, a soft species human with no biological armor, no enhanced reflexes, and no weapons stood almost no chance of surviving a direct contact charge from a creature of that category. Elian did not run. He did not freeze. He watched the creature coming, and at a moment that seemed, from my vantage point, impossibly late, he moved. Not dramatically, not with the explosive speed of an enhanced species making a desperate leap. He stepped to his left at a sharp angle and slightly forward, and the warbeast's primary strike limb passed through the space where he had been, standing close enough that I could see it displace the air near his shoulder. The warbeast carried past him. It took 3 handlers with restraint poles to bring it under control over the following 40 seconds. Elian stood where he had stepped to, watching the handlers work with what I can only describe as professional interest, as if he were studying their technique. When the situation was contained, and the handlers were speaking rapidly into their communications, I walked to where he was standing. I asked him if he was unharmed. He said he was. I asked him how he had known which direction to move and at which exact moment. He was quiet for a few seconds, looking at the warbeast as it was guided back toward the containment facility. Then he said, "The tension in the primary limb. Before any large animal strikes, there is a moment of muscular loading. You can read it if you know what to look for. You watch the limb, not the face. The face can mislead, the limb cannot." I asked where he had learned that. He said, "Old knowledge. Human children learn it very young in some parts of the world." His tone was entirely conversational. I looked at him for a long moment. He met my eyes without difficulty. He did not appear to need anything from me in that moment. No reassurance. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. He was simply there, steady and present, as he always was. I turned and walked back toward my guard, and I told them, quietly but with full clarity, that the post-incident report would include a full review of the containment protocols, and that nothing else about this event would be discussed in general staff communications. I had a reason for that instruction that I did not share with anyone yet. The reason was this. I had now seen 2 things that could not be attributed to training or chance alone. The feast, the warbeast. 2 events in which Elian Cole had faced something that his species should not have been equipped to handle, and had handled it so completely that the only evidence something had happened at all was visible in hindsight. I began to think about the word ordinary differently. I had been using it as a synonym for unremarkable. I started to wonder if, in the context of humans, ordinary meant something else entirely. Whether what humans called ordinary, what they produced routinely and without fanfare, and without considering it anything noteworthy, was in fact something that had no category in the existing galactic classification system, because nothing in the design of that system had anticipated it. I began to read about human history in the evenings, not diplomatic briefs, primary historical records, the kind of documentation that accumulated over centuries and was not curated for external audiences. The picture that formed over those weeks was disorienting. Humans had emerged on their world in a period defined by an extraordinary density of large, specialized predators. Their early biology had no notable defensive adaptations, no venom, no speed to rival the things that hunted them, no thick hide, no natural weapons of any consequence. Every biological advantage in their environment belonged to something else. The standard galactic evolutionary model would have predicted extinction within 50,000 years. They had been on their world for 300,000 years. What they had done instead of developing biological defenses was develop something the galactic classification system had no column for. They became, with absolute and relentless thoroughness, learners. They watched. They remembered. They communicated what they learned to each other and across generations. They took the limited toolkit of their soft, short-lived bodies and extracted from it capabilities that had no precedent in anything the galaxy had catalogued. They ran, not fast by predator standards, but for longer than any predator could sustain, not for hours, for days. Their body temperature regulation, alone among the large species of their world, allowed them to continue generating speed over vast distances while their prey collapsed from heat, exhaustion. They tracked not by superior senses but by reading signs in the ground, in broken vegetation, in the pattern of disturbed insects. They built tools and then built better tools, and then built tools to make their tools better. Every time the environment changed, instead of waiting for biology to catch up across generations, they thought of something new and implemented it within a single lifetime. They also, and this part of the historical record I found myself returning to repeatedly, refused to die. Not in a biological sense, in a cultural sense. Every time something tried to end them, whether it was environmental catastrophe or internal conflict on a scale that would have shattered any other civilization I could find in the historical record, or contact with forces that should have been impossibly beyond them, they adapted and continued. Not without cost. The historical record was entirely clear-eyed about the cost, but they continued. There was a phrase I found in a human historical text that I translated 3 times because I wanted to make certain I was rendering it correctly. The phrase was, "The difficult takes time, the impossible takes a little longer." The text attributed it to an unknown origin. It was listed simply as a common human saying. Common, as in something they considered obvious enough to not require a named source. I sat with that phrase for a long time. And then I looked across the palace courtyard from my study window, and I saw Elian in the garden below. He was sitting on the low stone bench near the water feature, the same spot he had found on his first evening here. He had a small notebook on his knee, and he was writing in it by hand. He did this most evenings. I had never asked what he wrote. Something about the privacy of it felt like it deserved to be left alone. As I watched, one of the young garden staff, a girl who was perhaps 15 years old by Cathara reckoning, came and sat near him on the opposite end of the bench. She was one of the sheer members of the household staff. She rarely spoke to anyone of status. She held a data tablet in her hands and appeared to be struggling with something on it. After a moment, she held it out toward Elian with the particular body language of someone asking for help and fully expecting to be turned away. He set down his notebook. He looked at the tablet. "He said something I could not hear from the window," she answered. "He said something else." Her posture changed. She leaned in to look at the screen alongside him. Over the next 10 minutes, I watched him walk her through whatever the problem was, not by solving it for her but, from what I could read in the gestures, by asking her questions that led her towards solving it herself. When she finally got it, the change in her expression was visible even from the distance of my window. He picked his notebook back up. She said something to him before she left. He smiled and gave a small nod. She walked away quickly, back toward the staff quarters, and she was standing just slightly taller than she had been when she arrived. I stood at my window for a long time after she left. I had been trying to understand what made Elian Cole different using the tools I had available. Biological metrics, diplomatic performance data, incident analysis, and those tools were giving me real information. I was not wrong to use them, but I was beginning to understand that they were measuring the edge of something whose center I had not yet located. Lord Drenveth found me still standing at the window sometime later. He came to deliver a routine briefing document, and then stood in silence for a moment beside me, following my line of sight to the garden below, which was now empty. He asked if anything required my attention. I told him no. I told him I was simply thinking. He started to leave and then stopped. He was quiet for a moment, and then, with the careful precision of a man who has spent his entire life choosing words as if they cost something, he said, "He is not what I expected." He said it without looking at me. I did not answer immediately. I watched the empty garden. The twin suns were beginning to lower toward the horizon, and the water feature caught their light in small pieces. Then I said, "No, he is not." Drenveth left without further comment. I stayed at the window until the light was gone. I knew before the night had happened that the Vorkai Syndicate was going to move against me. I had known for weeks in the slow, accumulated way that intelligence work produces certainty. Not a single clear signal, but dozens of small ones, each individually explainable, and together forming something that could not be explained any other way. The Vorkai Syndicate had operated in the periphery of Dominion space for decades, functioning as traders and occasionally as mercenaries when the price was sufficient. They were not militarily comparable to the Dominion by any standard measure, but they were patient in the way that organizations built on pure self-interest tend to be patient. They waited for openings. They were skilled at finding the moment when a ruler was temporarily weakened, either by internal dissent, or by the energy cost of expansion, or by the perception, however brief, that something important had changed in the power structure. My marriage had given them that perception. I had known it might. I had calculated it as an acceptable risk against the strategic value of the treaty. What I had not fully accounted for was the speed at which that perception would translate into action. The attack came on a night when the palace was hosting the annual Covenant Gathering, an event that brought together representatives from all 11 Dominion systems for a formal session of the Advisory Council. The significance of the timing was not subtle. A successful action against me during the gathering would not only remove me but would do so in front of the entire political architecture of the Dominion, creating a moment of maximum disruption. I had increased security protocols by 30% for the gathering period. It was not enough. The syndicate team did not come through the external perimeter. They came through the maintenance corridor system, which ran beneath the palace's 3 oldest wings and had been built 2 centuries before modern security integration. The entry point they used was a junction that appeared on architectural records as sealed. It had been resealed after entry in a way that fooled the sensor sweep. Someone had given them the corridor maps. Someone who knew this palace well. I found out none of this until later. In the moment, all I knew was what the sound told me. The gathering session had concluded for the evening, and I had moved with a reduced staff to the private reception hall on the upper floor, while the main council delegates were still in the formal dining chambers below. Elian was with me. He had been present at most of the gathering's formal sessions, positioned correctly by protocol, and had conducted himself throughout with the same easy steadiness that had by now become familiar to me. I had, without quite deciding to, grown accustomed to knowing where he was in a room. I was speaking with the system representative from Kethel 4 when the sound reached us. It was not a loud sound. It was the particular absence of sound that should have been present. The background noise of a functioning palace, the soft movement of staff, the distant murmur of ventilation systems, the occasional shift of guard positions, had simply stopped existing in the corridor outside the reception hall. The silence arrived like pressure. My personal guard captain, a woman named Veth Sora who had served me for 12 years, registered it at the same moment I did. She moved toward the door with her hand already on her sidearm. She opened it. The corridor outside was empty, which should not have been possible. There were always 2 guards at that position during events. I watched her register this fact. I watched her turn back toward me, with the expression of someone who has understood something they would have preferred not to understand. The sound that followed was not subtle. It came from the floor below us first, then quickly from the corridor to our left, and then, seconds later, from directly outside the hall's secondary entrance. Multiple points simultaneously. This was not opportunistic. This was rehearsed. Each sound was the same type. The metallic disruption of a Kethara heavy security door being overridden manually. Whoever had come through those maintenance corridors had brought the right tools for every lock they needed. Veth Sora had the remaining guard close the primary door and brace it. She was issuing rapid-coded communications into her headset, calling for the full emergency response team. The system representative from Kethel 4 had gone entirely still in the way that Kethara of his age and status went still when they understood that things were outside their ability to manage. 2 junior staff members had moved instinctively to the back of the room. I moved toward the secure alcove behind the ceremonial wall hanging. Standard protocol. In a breach situation, the ranking official in the room moves immediately to the secondary protected position while the guard team manages the perimeter. I was halfway there when Elian said my name, not loudly. He said it with the same tone he used when he wanted to draw my attention to something at a meeting. I turned. He was standing near the center of the room, and he was looking at the secondary entrance. Not the primary one where Veth Sora's guards were bracing. He said very quietly, "That door is the one they will come through first. It opens outward. The braced position your guards are taking will pull them away from it." Veth Sora started to answer. The secondary entrance came open before she finished drawing breath. There were 4 of them in the first group, wearing the close-fitting tactical gear the Syndicate used, which was designed for mobility in confined spaces. They had tools at their hips, and they were moving with the structured speed of people who had done this kind of entry work before. Veth Sora's 2 remaining guards moved to engage. The first exchange of the encounter happened very quickly, and I will not describe it in fine detail because it is not the part I need to account for. What I need to account for is what happened when the second group entered through the primary door, which they overrode from the outside in under 15 seconds. The brace did not hold. There were 6 of this group, and they had different tools, longer range, and they knew exactly where the room's ranking occupant was supposed to be standing. They were not wrong about where I was. I had not made it to the alcove. I was still mid-room when the primary door opened. Veth Sora was engaged with the first group. Her remaining free guard moved between me and the new entry point and went down in the first 3 seconds, not fatally but completely. He was out of the engagement. I was in that precise moment, alone in the center of the room with no functional cover between me and 6 armed individuals who had entered specifically to reach me. I want to be exact about what I felt in that moment because accuracy requires it. I felt for the first time in my 40-year reign something very close to fear, not the managed awareness of danger that a leader learns to carry as a professional tool. Actual fear, the kind that drops into the base of the stomach and stays there. And then Elian was beside me. He had crossed the room without my seeing him start moving. He was simply not there, and then he was there, standing slightly ahead of me and to my left, between the 6 incoming individuals and my position. He had nothing in his hands. The lead member of the incoming group hesitated for exactly 1 step when they saw him. I do not think they had intelligence on Elian that went beyond his classification data. A Class IV human stood in their path. The hesitation was brief, just long enough to be interesting, and then they continued forward. What happened in the following time I have attempted to reconstruct accurately in the days since, because my mind was not operating as an archive during those moments. It was operating as a survival instrument, and survival instruments record differently than historians. What I can report with certainty is the following. He was never still. Movement was the consistent element, not the large, momentum-driven movement of the kind of combat that Cathara soldiers trained for. Small movements, precise ones. He used the geometry of the room in a way that I had not thought possible, in a way that I was not sure I could have thought possible if I had been asked to predict it. He moved in between positions rather than toward them. He used what was there, the furniture, the wall surfaces, the distance between individuals, as part of what he was doing rather than as obstacles to it. He did not fight the way Cathara soldiers fought. Cathara military doctrine was built on biological advantage, on the strength that their physiology gave them and the training that multiplied it. He had none of that biological advantage. What he had instead was something I could not name in the moment, a quality of movement that suggested his body was not doing what he told it to do but what it already knew how to do. I know, because I reviewed the security recording afterward, that the full engagement lasted 4 minutes and 8 seconds. 6 armed individuals entered through the primary door, and not one of them was standing when it was over. Neither was Veth Sora's secondary engagement finished, and it was the appearance of Elian at the edge of that exchange that changed it. He said something to the remaining member of that group in a tone I could not hear from the recording, and the remaining member made the decision to put their tools on the floor. Elian was breathing harder than I had seen him breathe before. His hair was disordered. There was a cut on the back of one hand that was producing a modest amount of blood, which he appeared to have noticed and was keeping downward so it did not drop on the floor. He turned to me and asked if I was hurt. I told him I was not. He looked at me for a moment with those steady brown eyes, and I watched him regulate his breathing back toward normal with a deliberateness that was completely visible and somehow entirely unremarkable in the way that he did it, as if returning to equilibrium after this was simply a physical procedure he had done before and would do again. My communications were already alive with the emergency response team mobilizing. Veth Sora was moving toward the apprehended individuals with restraint equipment. Somewhere below us, the Covenant gathering delegates were being moved to secured positions, and the full palace defense protocol was executing. Elian looked at the cut on his hand. He found a piece of cloth in the room, from the decorative table dressing, and wrapped it efficiently around the cut without looking particularly concerned about it. His attention had moved to the doorway, scanning the corridor beyond for further activity. I stood in the center of the room and looked at him, and I felt something shift inside me that I did not yet have words for. Not gratitude alone, though that was present. Not surprise alone, though that was present too. It was something more structural, the way a very old belief, one that you have held for so long that you forgot you were holding it, changes when the evidence finally, completely, and without any room for reinterpretation contradicts it. I had believed, as the Galactic Registry had documented, and as my entire world had confirmed, that biological classification was the fundamental measure of a species. That what you were born with determined the ceiling of what you could become. That a species without natural power would always require protection, would always be, at the essential level, a dependent variable in the calculations of stronger beings. The security recording that I reviewed the following morning was 48 hours away. But standing in that room, I already knew what it would show me. A Class IV human, soft-bodied, unarmored, psionically inert, possessing no biological advantage that the Galactic Registry had found worth cataloging, had just done something that my elite palace guard had not been able to do. And he had done it not by being something the registry had failed to measure. He had done it by being exactly and entirely human. I looked at the data screen on my wrist communicator, where the emergency status updates were still arriving, and I looked at the translator implant, the notification, that had appeared at the edge of my vision during the engagement and was still blinking there. I had not had time to process it before. I looked at it now. It read, "Species classification error, cross-reference requested." I dismissed it without answering. Some errors, I was beginning to understand, were not errors at all. They were the first sign that the system doing the classifying had reached the edge of what it had been built to know. I did not sleep that night, not because of the security breach, though the emergency teams were working through every corridor, and the palace was lit and active until nearly sunrise. I did not sleep because I was thinking, and the thinking would not stop long enough to allow sleep anywhere near it. The situation had been assessed as contained by the 4th hour after the initial breach. The syndicate team, those who were apprehended, had been moved to the Dominion's secure custody facility. The entry point they had used had been found, documented, and sealed. Vethsora had a preliminary report on my desk before dawn. The internal security team had identified 2 individuals in the palace staff who had provided information to the syndicate. Both were in custody. The source of the corridor map had been traced. All of this was important work, and I read the report carefully. But my mind kept returning elsewhere. I had asked Elian, in the immediate aftermath, to have his hand treated by the palace medical staff. He had agreed without any particular resistance, which I had half expected him to resist, because of the way he seemed to operate by default, without requiring support of any kind. The medical staff reported to me the following morning, as I had asked them to, that the cut was minor, and that he had been cooperative and easy to treat, and had asked them several questions about their medical instruments that they had found their word delightful. I sat with that word for a moment, delightful. I was the sovereign of the Cathara Dominion. I had survived a direct security breach during the most politically significant gathering of my year. My husband, a being whom the entire galaxy had catalogued as a diplomatic accessory, had held a hostile engagement team in check with his bare hands while my trained guard had been otherwise occupied, and the medical staff's primary note was that he had been delightful. At approximately the 2nd hour before sunrise, when the emergency activity had quieted to the background hum of systematic checking, and the palace had found something approaching a working stillness, I went to the East Wing. I knocked on his door. This was not protocol. There was no protocol for what I was doing. I was simply doing it. He answered, after a short pause, not the groggy pause of someone woken from sleep, but the alert pause of someone who had also been lying awake. He was still dressed. He had been sitting at the small desk near the window with his notebook open, writing. He looked at me and moved back from the door to indicate I should come in. He did not appear surprised to see me, which meant either that he had expected it, or that he received unexpected visits from the Queen at the 2nd hour before sunrise with the same equanimity he appeared to receive everything else. I came in and sat in the chair near the window. He sat on the edge of the desk, at a comfortable conversational distance, and waited. I told him that I wanted him to explain something to me. He said he would try. I said, "The Galactic Registry has humans classified as a Class IV species." I had accepted this as accurate. "Last night I watched you do something that no Cathara soldier in my palace was in a position to do at that moment, including soldiers with biological advantages that should have made the comparison absurd. I want you to explain the gap between those 2 things." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, the one with the small bandage and the one without, resting on his knees. Then he looked back at me. He said, "The registry measures passive traits. What is the biological armor rating? What is the baseline strength index? What is the lifespan? What is the psionic potential? These are things you measure once in a controlled environment and then record. They are real measurements, but they measure the starting point. They do not measure what a species does with the time between the starting point and any given moment. I told him to continue, he said. Humans evolved in an environment that wanted to kill us at every stage. I am not being poetic about that. Our world had large predators with biological advantages far beyond what we had. We had no armor. We had no natural speed that matched our prey or our hunters. Our senses were not exceptional compared to the things we were competing with. The biological assessments of our early species would have predicted we would not last. We were, on paper, prey. He paused for a moment and then said, "We became something else because the other option was not existing." I told him that other species had faced similarly hostile environments and had not produced the same result. He nodded and said, "I know, I have thought about that. I do not think it was only the hostile environment. I think it was a specific combination of things. We had a level of social bonding that was unusually strong, and that bonding created a transmission system for learning. Not just biological learning across generations, which every species does in some form. Direct, fast, cumulative learning. One human learns something and can communicate the full detail of it to 1,000 others before the next generation is even born. We did not wait for evolution. We taught each other," he said, "and then we practiced. This is the part that I think is hardest to translate into the registry's framework. Humans practice things. We take a physical capability or a learned skill and we repeat it until it is no longer a conscious action, until the body does it without asking the mind for permission. You saw this last night. What I did in that room was not thinking. It was the result of a very large number of hours of physical practice, done years ago, which my body simply performed when the conditions called for it." I asked how many hours he considered. Then he said, "For the specific disciplines involved, probably somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 hours over the course of my life." He said it the way one might say the color of a wall, as a neutral fact. 5,000 hours. I thought about what that meant. I thought about the fact that he had conducted those hours at some point before arriving at my palace to be a diplomat, before his file described him as unremarkable, before the galaxy had looked at him and seen a Class IV life form and stopped looking. I asked him if this was unusual among humans. He said no. He said most humans had some area of knowledge or physical practice in which they had invested a similar number of hours. Different areas for different individuals. Some were mathematical, some were mechanical, some were physical, some were interpersonal. He said, "The specific combination varies enormously from person to person, but the underlying behavior, the investment of significant hours in the repeated refinement of a skill until it becomes embedded, is extremely common." He said it was so common that humans generally did not think of it as remarkable. They called it simply having a talent, or being good at something. Having a talent. I heard the words and felt something in the architecture of my thinking reorganize itself. I asked him why he had not told me this before. He looked at me steadily and said, "You did not ask, and there was no event requiring it." He said this without any rebuke in his voice. He was not pointing out a failure on my part. He was simply being accurate. I looked at him across the small lit room, this ordinary, unremarkable human who had 5,000 hours of embedded physical discipline in his body, and a mind that had read my chief negotiator before she sat down at the table, who had survived my court's traditional venom test without a visible breath out of place, who had stepped aside from a war beast using principles that human children learned young, who had held a hostile engagement in a room full of armed individuals while protecting a queen he was bound to by treaty, but I was beginning to understand by something else as well. I asked him to tell me about human history. He asked what aspect. I said, "All of it." He looked at me for a moment, and then a small, real smile crossed his face. The same one I had seen on the landing bay when he looked up at my sky for the first time. He got up from the desk and brought his notebook over. He sat in the chair across from me, and he talked until the twin suns came up. He told me about the events in human history when everything had gone against them, and they had continued anyway. Not because they were indestructible. The historical record was clear-eyed about the cost, he said, echoing something I had found myself in the documents I had been reading. But they had a relationship with being finished that differed from what the galaxy had modeled for them. He told me about human adaptations over centuries of contact with their own hostile environment, and then with each other. He told me about the moments when human civilization had been genuinely close to an ending and what had happened instead. I listened to all of it. By the time the morning staff began moving through the palace corridors and the light outside the window had shifted from the gray of pre-dawn to the early copper of sunrise, I had a better and more complete picture of what I had married than I had possessed at any previous point. I also had a different question than the one I had come with. I had come wanting to understand the gap between the registry's classification and what I had seen. I understood that gap now. The registry was not wrong exactly. The passive biological measurements were accurate. What the registry had failed to include was a measurement for what a species builds over the course of its existence, what it chooses to become, and what it refuses to stop being. There was no column for that in the registry. There probably should be. But the new question was simpler and more personal, and I did not ask it out loud because I was not ready to hear myself ask it. The question was, who had sent him to me, and what had they understood that I had not? The human government had chosen this man specifically. They had sent him to negotiate with a species that controlled 11 star systems, to a court that would view him as negligible, to a political environment where every measure of conventional power worked against him. And he had arrived with his travel case and his notebook, and his 5,000 hours and his quiet, steady eyes. And in the months since, he had done nothing other than exactly what he was. I thought about the Vareth corridor and the 6 years of negotiation before Elian arrived. I thought about Oreth Tel saying that she believed he had already known what they would accept before the sessions began. I thought about how the treaty framework, which had been immovable through 6 years of standard negotiation, had begun to show movement within 3 weeks of his arrival. I thought about the young garden staff member and the way she had walked away standing, slightly taller than when she had arrived. And I thought about Lord Drenveth saying, quietly and with great precision, "He is not what I expected," and then leaving without further comment, which from Drenveth was the most complete statement of reassessment possible. I looked at Elian, who had finished talking and was watching me with the patient attention he brought to everything. And I thought, the human government did not send me a diplomat. They sent me the best possible version of exactly what they are. And they knew I would not see it, because the galaxy never sees it, not until it is too late for that not seeing to matter. I did not say any of this out loud. I said instead that he should rest, and that we had a great deal to discuss with the full council once the security situation had been formally closed. He nodded and said that he would be ready whenever I needed him. I stood up. I moved toward the door. I stopped before I reached it. I turned and said, simply, that I was glad he was here. He said, with that same real and unhurried honesty that characterized everything he did, "So am I." I left his rooms and walked back through the brightening palace corridors, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt something that I initially did not recognize because I encountered it so rarely. I felt, without qualification, safe. The full emergency council convened at midday. I had them all in the main chamber, every system representative who had been present at the Covenant gathering, the full senior advisory board, the heads of both the military and the intelligence services, and Veth Sora in full formal capacity with her incident documentation. The chamber held power and experienced the way a deep reservoir holds water, and I had stood in this room for 40 years presenting analysis, making decisions, and being the person everyone in it was looking to. I was still that person, but I was carrying something different into the room with me this time. I was carrying a recalibration, one that had been building for months, and had completed itself sometime between the dark hours of the emergency and the sunrise conversation in the East Wing. I presented the security assessment first. I presented it without editorializing and let the documentation speak. The breach, the entry method, the scale of the operation, the internal coordination that had been required, the speed and precision of the syndicate team's movements. By the time Veth Sora finished her portion of the presentation, every face in that chamber had rearranged itself into something closer to gravity than it had worn when they sat down. Then I turned to the second portion of what I had to say. I told them that the incident had been contained. I told them that the Covenant gathering's political purpose remained intact, and that the treaty processes currently underway would continue without interruption. I told them that the security review I was ordering would address the identified vulnerabilities, and that the full outcome would be implemented before any similar gathering was held. And then I said, I want to discuss something that the incident has made necessary to address, directly. The room went quiet in that particular way. It went quiet when I was about to say something that was not yet predictable. I told them that I had spent the preceding months conducting a private review of the galactic classification system as it applied to humanity. I told them that the review had been prompted by a series of observations that did not align with the documented classification. I told them that the events of the previous night had completed that review to my satisfaction. I said, humanity is not a Class IV species. The designation is not inaccurate with respect to the measurements it includes. The problem is that the measurements it includes were never designed to capture what is, in fact, humanity's most significant characteristic. Lord Drenveth, who was seated to my right, did not move. He was listening with the total stillness of a man who has already done his own recalculation and is waiting to see if his sovereign has arrived at the same result. I said, the Galactic Registry measures passive biological traits: armor, speed, lifespan, psionic potential. These measurements produce an accurate snapshot of a species at rest. They do not measure what a species does over time with the conditions it has been given. They do not measure the accumulation of skill and knowledge that a species builds across generations and embeds into each individual before begin. They do not measure the cultural and psychological characteristics that determine how a species responds to a situation that exceeds its biological capacity. I said humanity has been, throughout its history, consistently placed in situations that exceeded its biological capacity. The historical record of what it does in those situations is the most significant data set available on the species. And no one in this chamber, myself included, had been using that data set. The chamber was completely quiet. I continued. I told them what Elaine had told me in the hours before sunrise, and what I had found in my own reading of human historical records, and what I had observed over the preceding months in my own palace with my own eyes. I was precise about it. I gave them the feast and the war beast and the negotiation sessions, and the things Orith Tel had said, and the things Drenveth had said, and the things the garden staff girl had shown simply by walking away from that bench a fraction taller than she had arrived. I told them what I had watched happen in the reception hall the previous night, not in dramatic language, in direct, accurate language, because that was the only language that served the room in the moment. I said, 6 armed and prepared individuals with the correct equipment and rehearsed coordination entered that room with the intention of ending my tenure as sovereign. I am standing here today because Elian Cole was in that room, and because Elian Cole is a human, and because we have been catastrophically mismeasuring what that means. The silence in the chamber was no longer simply attentive. It had texture to it now, the texture of something shifting. Representative Gorithvar, the elderly border house lord who had sat beside Elian at the Feast of Venom and talked to him about agricultural tariffs, cleared his throat and asked, with the careful precision of someone choosing each word, "What is your recommendation, Sovereign?" I said, "I am not making a recommendation today. I am making a statement of fact. The statement of fact is that our diplomatic partnership with humanity needs to be reconsidered from the ground up, not because the terms were wrong, but because we negotiated them without understanding what we were negotiating with." I said, "The Vareth Corridor Treaty, when it is concluded, will be the most strategically significant agreement this Dominion has entered in 2 centuries. I want every person in this chamber to understand that the entity on the other side of that treaty is not a Class IV species in any practical sense. We have been fortunate that this reality revealed itself to us in our own palace, under controlled conditions, on our own timeline. I want us to be clear about what a different timeline would have looked like." Orith Tel, who had been sitting very straight in her chair for the entirety of my address, said, "The assessment you are presenting suggests that any species which has systematically underestimated humanity would find the correction extremely sudden." I said, "Yes," she said, "and the Vorkai Syndicate operated on the assumption that the human consort was a negligible variable in their calculation." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment and then said with her characteristic precision, "I will amend my negotiation framework." There was a soft sound from around the chamber that I recognized as the sound of consensus forming in a room full of people who had all been thinking the same thing individually and had just discovered that they were not alone in it. I let the moment complete itself. Then I moved to the governance agenda, the follow-up actions from the security review, the scheduling of the resumed treaty sessions, the communications plan for the Dominion's external partners. The council worked through it with the systematic efficiency of 40 years of practice. It was a good council. I had built it slowly and carefully, and it had served me well. But something was different in the room as we worked, a quality of attention, as if everyone had slightly recalibrated the instrument they were using to measure things. The session ended in the late afternoon. As the representatives and advisors moved toward the exits, Drenveth approached me. He waited until the chamber was largely empty. Then he stood beside me and looked at the long curved table, as if examining it for something. He said, "I owe an apology." I told him he did not. I told him that the classification system had been in place for centuries, and that his assessment had been based on the same data set everyone else was using. He said the data was sufficient. I should have looked further. I said, "So should I." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He is a fortunate choice." I thought about the word fortunate. I thought about whether it was accurate. I had made the choice of Elian Cole for political reasons, for treaty reasons, for the strategic value of the Vareth corridor. I had not made it for any quality I had recognized in him, because I had not recognized any particular quality at the time. I had looked at a file and seen an unremarkable human diplomat, and I had made a calculation. Was it fortunate? Or had the human government, who had chosen him specifically for this assignment, made a calculation of their own, one that accounted for exactly how he would be perceived, and exactly what that perception would allow him to do? I thought about the phrase I had found in the historical records. The difficult takes time. The impossible takes a little longer. A common human saying, attributed to no one in particular, considered obvious enough not to require a named source. I said to Drenveth, "I am not sure it was fortune." He looked at me and then looked away, and I saw in his expression the same recalculation that had been running in my own mind for weeks now arriving at its final position in his. He said, "No, I suppose it was not." He left. I stood in the empty chamber for a while. That evening I went to the garden. Not because I had decided to. I found myself walking there without having consciously set a direction, which was unusual for me. I was a person who generally set directions consciously. Elian was in the garden. He was in his usual place on the low stone bench near the water feature. He did not have his notebook with him this evening. He was simply sitting there in the cooling air, watching the light change on the water, the way the twin suns moved toward setting. I sat down beside him, not at the opposite end of the bench, beside him. He did not say anything immediately, neither did I. The garden was quiet. Somewhere in the trees above the eastern wall, one of the silver-winged birds that nested there was producing its evening sound, a low, looping call that Cathara composers had been trying to reproduce in music for 3 centuries without quite succeeding. After a while I said, "I spoke to the council today." He said he knew. Isareth had mentioned it. I said, "I told them they had been measuring the wrong things." He said, "How did they receive it?" I said, "The way intelligent people receive accurate information when they have already suspected it. With the expression of people who are relieved they are not the only one who noticed." He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Something just short of it, private and warm. I looked at the water. The light on it was doing something particular at this time of day, breaking into small bright shapes that moved independently of each other, each one a slightly different shade of the same color. I had looked at this water feature for decades without quite seeing that. I said, "The human government chose you very deliberately for this assignment." He said after a moment, "Yes." I said, "They knew how you would be perceived here." He said, "They had a reasonable estimate." I said, "And they sent you anyway, knowing that the perception would work in their favor." He was quiet for a slightly longer moment this time. Not the quiet of someone who does not know what to say, the quiet of someone who is deciding how precisely to say what they know. He said, "They sent me because the work needed to be done, and because I was the right person for it. The perception issue was a variable they assessed and accepted." I said, "And you accepted it?" He said, "I have been in rooms where I was underestimated before. It is not uncomfortable. It is actually useful." I looked at him. He was looking at the water, the same way he looked at everything, with that full, unhurried attention that I had been trying to properly categorize since the first day he arrived. I said, "I underestimated you." He said, "Yes. But you also watched. That is the more important part. You watched and you updated. That is not a common thing in any species." I said, "My entire classification system was wrong." He said, "The system was right about what it measured. It just measured too little." I said, "I want to know what I missed, all of it. Not just what the historical record shows. What you know from being human. What your people understand about themselves that the registry never captured." He looked at me then, the same direct, settled gaze that had been the first thing I noticed about him. Steady without effort, present without performance. He said, "That will take a long time to explain properly. I am not in a hurry." A silence settled between us that was nothing like the silences I was accustomed to. The silences in my life were generally political. They carried weight and subtext, and the managed distance between people who hold power near each other. This silence had none of that. It was simply 2 people sitting beside a water feature in the evening, while a bird made its looping call in the trees above. He said, quietly and without ceremony, that he was glad we were having this conversation. I said that so was I. The twin suns continued their descent. The light on the water changed again, warming toward the deep colors of full evening. The silver-winged bird sang its impossible song in the branches above us. And somewhere in the palace behind us, the enormous, Complicated machinery of the Kethera Dominion continued its work, as it always had, as it always would. I sat beside my husband on the bench in the garden, and thought about all the things that the galaxy had decided it already knew. I thought about classification systems and the things they left out. I thought about what a species became when the only option was to keep becoming. I thought about 5,000 hours and the patient, unhurried accumulation of understanding over a lifetime, over generations, over centuries of absolute refusal to be only what the biological record said you were. I had stood at the head of the most powerful political structure in this quadrant of the galaxy for 40 years. I had made decisions that shaped the lives of billions of beings across 11 star systems. I had negotiated with beings who could reshape matter with their thoughts, and beings who had lived for thousands of years, and beings whose biological capabilities made my own physiology look modest by comparison. And I had never in all of that time sat beside anyone and felt as clearly as I felt now that the person next to me was exactly where they were supposed to be and doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, not for any strategic reason, not for any reason that could be put into a registry or a file or a diplomatic assessment, but simply because they were the thing they were, and they were fully quietly, without fanfare or performance, being it. The Galactic Registry would update its classification of humanity eventually. These things moved slowly in the bureaucratic machinery of galactic record-keeping. Someone would file the reassessment, the data would be reviewed, the committee that handled such things would convene, and after a significant amount of time, a new designation would appear in the record. I was not particularly interested in what designation they chose. What I had learned was not a classification. Classifications were starting points. They were the measurements taken in controlled environments, the passive readings of what something was, before anything had been asked of it. What I had learned was what happened after the starting point. What a species did with the distance between where it began and where it stood at any given moment. What it chose to build, and what it refused to stop building, regardless of what any registry had to say about the ceiling. You did not measure a human by what they were. You measured them by what they refused to stop being. I had married the most ordinary man the human government had available to send me. A man with a travel case and a notebook and brown hair and a calm expression and 5,000 hours of patience and practice and accumulated wisdom, embedded so deeply in his body and his mind that it moved without being asked to. The galaxy had looked at him and seen a Class IV life form. I had been given the gift of proximity, close enough and long enough, and with enough paying attention to see what was actually there. I, Valeth Sorn, sovereign of the Kethera Dominion, ruler of 11 star systems, sat beside him in the fading evening light and understood, with the full clarity that comes only after a long and necessary recalibration, that I had not married down. I had, without knowing it, without intending it, without any of the careful strategic calculation I prided myself on, made the most important and correct decision of my reign. I had married a human, and the universe, which had laughed at the idea, had simply not been paying close enough attention.